Good morning. This is FEPS Talks. Today with you, myself, Anna Kolesnichenko. I'm Economic Policy Analyst at FEPS, and Cornel Ban is our guest today. He is writing a policy brief on innovation, financing, scale up for European Union. What can we learn from China? And he's going to present this later today at FEPS, and we decided to use this opportunity to have a small talk with him for the greater audience. So welcome, Cornel.
Thank you for inviting me.
To ask you first, why this shift to China? What moved you this direction?
There's a two-part answer. One answer is intellectual, in the sense that I've been working for over 2 decades on how countries use industrial policy to stay or become more industrially competitive. And I've looked at Spain, France, Brazil, and when industrial policy came back to Europe, and the term was actually used, it was no longer an insult or something to fear. I became very interested in how Europeans use it, because we use it very differently from what we today call developmental states in Asia, right? And this leads me to the second part of my answer, which is a more practical answer. And the practical answer is that what is Europe economically? Europe is largely an export-led industrial powerhouse, but industrial powerhouse that is in a bit of trouble. We no longer lead in industry, and who leads in industry is not the usual American or Asian kind of liberal juggernaut, right? Or developmental state in Korea or Singapore or Japan. But it is China now. In practical terms, I was in Copenhagen, and Denmark, as you know, leads on wind turbines. And I spoke to people in the wind turbine industry, which pays very good wages, nice unionized labor. It's like an ideal, typical case of social democratic marriage of competitiveness and solidarity, right? And they were scared. They were scared not because China makes things cheaper, but because it makes them more innovative. So they were afraid of a future in which the frontier of that sector is dominated by highly innovative Chinese firms that are leapfrogging Europe. They're not just catching up, they're leapfrogging. And Europe sits in a kind of risk zone of migrating from the global core of industrial competitiveness, and with that of the social model that industrial competitiveness enables, into being a sort of semi-peripheral appendix of potentially Chinese car industry, Chinese clean tech, Chinese digital. And I was, I'm Romanian. I was always very interested in, how the old socialist economies thrived and collapsed. But China was not that. It was a very different system that in a way combined elements of the American system with that of the Korean, Japanese, a bit of Europe, especially France in the post-war period, and a bit of the socialist legacy, to come up with a hybrid that we don't properly understand. We just see its effects, right? So as a social democrat who, cares about where do we get the resources to keep the European social model at least alive, if not thrive at new heights, the big question was, we've never had this challenge before, right? For 100 years, Europe was used to leading on technology. And when we had little challenges, like from Japan and the Americans on digital, but never on manufacturing. And Japan was something you could accommodate, right? But China is a very different animal, right? So I said, maybe we should start reverse engineering some of the plumbing of the Chinese model that are not necessarily attached to their political system, but represent a kind of innovation of how the state intervenes and coordinates with various market and societal actors to come up with a situation in which, Germany, the mothership of European industrial power, right, is challenged for the first time super seriously by somebody that they haven't taken very seriously.
Actually, this leads me to another question. So, here in Europe, in Brussels, we have lots of talk about European Investments Union, Savings and Investments Union, and this attempt to emulate the American model of innovation financing. And people talk, for example, about using pension funds more creatively, like encouraging them to invest in this venture capital financing. So why China? So do you think that Chinese model is better suited for Europe, or because so far I hear only American example here?
Yeah. It's a very good question, and there are very good reasons to think of the American model of financing new sectors through the venture capital channel. And I don't think it's a bad idea that we have tried to do that. But it was a bad strategy to use only that as the model. What do I mean by that? What I mean by that is that Europe and America have very different growth models. They grow through very different engines. It's enough to look at, our trade. Yeah. So we export to the United States more manufactured goods than they export to us, but they are a net exporter to Europe of digital. So to the point that with the Greenland crisis, we became aware of the fact that the Americans might turn off the digital infrastructures, as the Ukrainians have learned, in fact, as a means of leverage. So the American financing ecosystem through the venture capital, private venture capital arm, but also the American government, DARPA and other institutions deeply embedded in the American security state are big government, as the Americans call it, investors into frontier innovations. Europeans only look at the private side, but let's remember Mazzucato et al., on how the American government, especially now under Trump, they are huge shareholders now in Intel, in critical minerals. The Pentagon is a shareholder in critical minerals now. They're buying up shares in Texas-based smelters. So we look at this kind of private capitalist America, but there is this other America that looks more like China, right? Which is areas where the private investors don't go because the risk is too high. So the American state takes the risk. I taught in American academia. I did my postdoc in the Ivy League at Brown University. Every single lab there in the physics department was financed in this way through the American scientific state and the American security state. We don't have a counterpart to that in Europe. So let's also recognize that. But why China? Why do we need more China, Korea to look at? The European growth model is very different in the sense that, as I said, we grow through industrial manufacturers. This is our growth model. Yeah. If you look at the share of export growth in total GDP growth, in America, it's consumption has the largest share. In Europe, it is industrial. And it is a specific kind of industrial, a lot of precision engineering and so on, right? This is our tradition. Now, this is precisely the sector that's being challenged by China, is this engineering dimension. And on top of that, the Chinese also create a sort of competition to America in the digital sector, to the point that a lot of people who are in the know, believe that in artificial intelligence, the Chinese might come on top because they can more easily scale up the energy supply that's necessary. So in a way, Europe paradoxically is more like China in the sense that, like China, we are an industrial export growth model. The Chinese are the same. We compete with each other. They are our only peer competitor, frankly, right? The US doesn't compete with us in manufacturers. That's our already embedded advantage. So I was like, okay, so why do we look only at America, given the fact that they don't compete on industrial manufacturers with us, right? So let's look what our competitor is doing in industrial manufacturing. This is where I started. It's a very practical answer at the end of the day. And we spent decades watching how China catches up with us. But in the last 5 years, I think it has become patently obvious to everyone that China hasn't just caught up. China has leapfrogged us in many sectors, and it's just the beginning. It's just the beginning. We still have an edge in very few sectors. We still have an edge on China. Aircraft, to some extent in pharma. They're coming big on pharma. I don't know. I'm not sure about commercial aircraft, how soon it will happen. But we are losing the car industry dominance in terms of technological innovation and what is the main powertrain. The Chinese definitely did that. The entire clean tech value chain. So our entire energy autonomy, if it were to come through the renewable channel, it cannot be done decoupled from China anymore, right? So I was like, how do we understand this? It's not just enough to say, oh, China is an authoritarian system, etc. Are they successful because they're authoritarian, or are they successful because of something else? Are they successful because they learn how to coordinate differently? Are they successful because maybe they create policy hybrids that mix very liberal with very dirigist, with very state-led approaches in ways that they are completely agnostic about in terms of what are the intellectual origins of each policy instrument, right? How much of the Chinese authoritarian state, and the literature uses the term fragmented authoritarianism, because Beijing is actually a lot less powerful than we usually think it is. It's the provincial governments that are the most important in the industrial innovation sphere. Politically, of course, Beijing dominates, but in the economy, we have to look at Chinese provinces who are like European member states to some extent. There are some comparisons we can make. So that's why China. And I'm not saying we should reverse engineer everything. We have to be in the position in which we can ask curious questions and try to ask how much of this would travel in the European democratic space, at the level of the EU intergovernmental space. Of course, we are extremely different politically. But also, and this is, I'm going to end with this. This is another way in which we're kind of more like China and less like the US. The American government doesn't own very much in the economy, right? European governments still own large assets. We have large SOEs in energy, infrastructure, banking sector. I mean, Germany has a huge state-owned banking sector, right? The American government has very small financial institutions. So, to the extent that the Chinese state mobilizes state-owned financial assets to power up a commercialization of engineering innovations to leapfrog Europe, I also ask myself, to what extent maybe we're underusing this European existing forms of state ownership at the EU level and at the state level. Maybe we're using grant-based approaches to innovation when we should use more equity-based, where the state should be an equity investor. Maybe we're too stuck on Matsukato's entrepreneurial state, and we kind of fail to see that there is a much more complex story to how Chinese innovation came about than the story that we get from America, which is, Matsukato is an American story of how the American state is a kind of Promethean state. It's not a liberal state that we conventionally think of. So this is what led me to say, we should have a bit more respect about how the Chinese do it, and B, kind of try to be analytical about how much of it is contingent on their political system and administrative discipline, and type of state market relations, and how much of that is actually really smart innovation and industrial policy. And I think we're just at the beginning of understanding that. Very few people are doing back-to-back China-Europe comparison. It's a growing field now, but it's very recent.
Well, I think now it's a good time if you explain a bit more about the Chinese model. You talk in your paper about government guidance funds. What is this? What is this animal?
I mean, it's something that we kind of have in Europe. So if you think, what is a government guidance fund? It's a financial institution where not just the central government, but it could be a municipality or a province, basically is an equity investor in commercializing and scaling, bringing to industrial scale innovations that would otherwise not elicit the interest of private financiers. So basically the state says, if you private financial guys don't want to go into this, I'll go first. I'm kind of certifying that this is serious, and you guys can come on board together with me. We already do that in Europe with the European Investment Fund. We have In Germany, the state-owned bank, federal bank KfW, has KfW Capital that kind of then takes this money in a more risky direction than a bank would. So the problem with European and Chinese state-owned banks, we have very similar problems. The Chinese government owns 80% of finance. Okay, that's the big difference between us and them, right? And it's mostly banking. But their banks are also risk-averse and boring and right? So, and the Chinese were like, okay, if even us with an authoritarian system cannot compel these guys to take more risk, right? How can you guys do that? So they created these financial institutions that they looked at us, at what we've done. They looked at Canada. There's a bunch of other examples in the world. Since the 1970s, governments have said there are some areas that are even too risky for the most carnivorous private venture capitalists, right? So we'll go there first, and maybe we'll find in European universities technological innovations that can be Europe's next industrial champions. And I want to bring this question here that I received in China, because I went there at the beginning and I said, oh, but there's so much waste in what you do. Europeans look at you and say, of course, it's very easy for you to throw all these subsidies and shower everyone with money. Something's going to come out of that. And they say, yeah, sure, maybe there's a lot of that. But let me ask you something. You have a much more kind of elegant system in Europe, and we respect it very much. But can you name me 2 or 3 new, globally relevant industrial companies that have come out in Europe in the last 10 years and they're of global relevance? Something that's BYD or Cattle or Leapmotor. These are 10-year-old, 15-year-old companies, and we control completely the market. How many of them do you have with that system of yours, right? And he said, for us, these guidance funds are like a public utility, like water and gas, right? We don't care about it, whether we get returns on it. What we care is that we take you out of the market on a technologically innovative basis. You look at us as just providing a lot of subsidies. And yes, we do that, but less and less. We actually are moving away from a subsidy model into kind of a subsidized equity model. We don't just like give grants and price subsidies, right? You guys are doing a lot of that. You are more interventionist than we are, right? We combine a lot of state risk appetite, but you need a channel for that. And that channel is the guidance fund. Now, imagine, what is the guidance fund? Imagine European Investment Fund, which is essentially a more risk-accepting arm of the European Union's own bank, European Investment Bank. In France, we have BPI France. We have many examples of this in Europe. But there are very big differences in terms of the scale. So for an industrial economy the size of ours, who wants to compete with the Chinese industrial power, we have a lot less money on that. And the way we design these interventions, in China, they have very strict technological mandates for these funds. And these funds, they have their sub-funds, and they have like specific parts of the value chain that's coordinated so that they shower universities and other innovative startups with money. And then we do pretty well at this. The problem with us is that the moment a European startup is very successful and it needs to build 10 factories and it costs 300 million euros, there is no money for that. So they get snapped by American or Asian investors. So it's a form of brain drain. We have an amazing innovation ecosystem still in Europe, right? And some people say, oh, Europe is a sinking ship in manufacturing. Yes, but maybe. But it is because we don't make all the choices that are necessary to stop that. And the first choice I would make is that in high tech industrial innovations, European universities produce a huge amount of innovation that's not commercialized. The Chinese commercialize 3 times more than we do. That's the problem that I'm trying to address with this study. And we don't have a real counterpart in terms of the scale of the Chinese financing of this commercialization, nor do we have a more disciplined coordination in how the available fewer resources that we have can be targeted at sectors that we can all Europeans would agree that are really important for employment and competitiveness into the future. This is the big difference between us and them. It's not the fact that they have guidance funds. We have them too, right? But they are structured differently. They take a lot more risk and they give money precisely to those companies that we lose. Yeah, it's when you need the hundreds of millions to build up factories and hire workers at scale, and build Europe's next industrial giants and answer that question. How many new industrial giants do you have in Europe? No, all of them are like 80, 100 years old, right? The Chinese, almost all of them are 10, 15, at most 20 years old. And the most innovative ones are like 5, 6 years old. And we're talking about multi-billion, 15 billion euro companies that they've created from nothing. And that wasn't created by an authoritarian state. Actually, the authoritarian state put its bet on other companies than the ones that have succeeded here. But they haven't succeeded because of markets and heroism and so on. They succeeded because there was a deep coordination of both supply and demand. Like people put their money into innovations that then had a market because the government ensured there's a market in some form. And then they discipline these firms. Like you can't just like waste and burn money through. We can elaborate more on that.
Well, you're talking like money, big pots of money, looking at European
and design,
Union.
the design of how you use them. That's even more important than money itself.
Okay, so let's touch a bit more on this, because in European Union, of course, we have this budget discussion, for example, and people say we don't have money. And after the COVID, many countries have also like big debts now. So money is a concern. So where do we find money in Europe for this kind of large scale investments?
I mean, the thing is that, okay, China has a multi-trillion euro state-owned financial sector. So let's take that off the table. We just don't have that. And then these huge state-owned banks and insurance companies and asset management companies, and they're not like BlackRock because they manage state-owned assets. And one of the biggest financial companies in the world, SASAC, is a Chinese state-owned asset manager, right? So they have these like huge, like these financial behemoths that the state can control. They don't control it directly, actually. They have their own autonomy. Some of them are harder to control than others. But it's immense, right? So first off, we don't have that, right? We have, if you ever add everything up, is maybe you can get to 1.5 to 2 trillion. In terms of European state-owned financial institutions, right? So tiny bit. So let's take that off the table. But what we have the Chinese don't have is we have 13 trillion in pension funds, right? Now, what do we mean by pension funds, though, is the big question here. What kind of equivalent, like who would fund more and smarter European innovation financial vehicles that would be the counterparts of this Chinese pension fund, of these Chinese guidance funds? And it would be the kind of pension funds that the Nordic countries have. I mean, if you look at Denmark, why is Denmark the world's biggest exporter still, we'll see for how long, of offshore wind turbines? It's because the Danish pension funds have been the biggest investor in offshore wind. So they made sure there's demand for this offshore wind technology. And these pension funds provide higher returns for pensioners in Germany. So I'm going to have a much bigger retirement than a colleague in Germany who's like 5 kilometers away. Same job, almost the same salary, much bigger returns. And these pension funds were negotiated over a 10-year period. It was a big social democratic process with the labor unions agreeing, seeing the benefits and the downsides that happened. And they act as a form of patient finance for the industrial ambitions of the Danish state. Okay, but the second condition of these pension funds actually taking the risk, and instead of just buying government bonds, is the government guaranteed a certain electricity price for those offshore wind turbines that would give them at par or higher returns than just buying, very safe assets, right? So to make this European, in a way, it's a form of cooperative finance, because all the shareholders are the future pensioners, kind of agree that their pension won't be destroyed by like some adventuristic industrial policy ambitions. And we have a bad example now in Europe with Northvolt in Sweden. When that collapsed, all the pension funds lost money because they were part of co-founders of this. Europe's ambition to become autonomous on batteries, right, was co-funded by Danish and Norwegian pension funds who lost money on it. Same on green hydrogen. So the question here is, we would have the money, but you need much more planning, much more coordination across sectors between European institutions and national governments. Because if you don't do that, then you're going to scare people. Like if you have 3 or 4 large bankruptcies of big startups in which the pension funds are involved, why would workers agree to their pension money being risked by European governments who may want to leapfrog China back and make some crazy bids? Well, the Northvolt case shows that we have been very bad at coordinating industrial policy ambitions, and we have lost Danish pensioners' money on that. So, I mean, as a social democrat, I'm very concerned with how do we design a policy system and the regulatory environment and the sort of, I don't like the term, but de-risking environment for these European pension funds who are our biggest pool of wealth that's kind of collectively owned, to be an answer to China's financial system for innovation and scale-up finance. And I think that's why we're having a panel today and a debate and getting more brains to talk. I don't have the ultimate answer to this, because these contexts for difference that ensure there's a return are fiscal money. They're expensive, right? Governments might actually end up paying a lot. In Denmark, they actually ended up not paying a lot because wind energy was very effective, and it turned Denmark into then a global exporter of wind turbines. And then the Chinese are coming for that. Like they came after solar panels, and it's a big stress now in this sector. So I think the Nordic countries have actually a pretty good balance between public financing of innovation. We have in Denmark IFO, which is essentially a state-owned venture capital fund. We have centralized a lot of the innovation funds into one. Then we have the pension funds. The Danish state doesn't own a development bank. The Danish state is actually quite liberal in terms of ownership, except in this area. So we're getting this collective ownership of our pensions to act as patient finance for industrial policy ambitions. And it's worked so far. But even in Denmark, even in the best of cases, we suffer from a pan-European coordination of the supply and demand of commercializing these innovations. Because we have, the Northvolt case has been a sobering experience in that regard. And the European Commission promised a lot of things on green hydrogen, but the infrastructure wasn't delivered. People who put money on that lost them big time. That will never happen in China. You see, this is what we should look at China as. How do they coordinate between these provinces to compete viciously with each other, right? Like really viciously. There is provincial protectionism, like you have member state protectionism in Europe. It's not like a perfect unified market there either. And Beijing doesn't control these provinces very easily, right? But what they do have is they have a pipeline for getting capital to go into these new sectors, create global companies who come back and take ours out.
So you see the need for more initiatives or coordination from European Union. What would that be? For example, should it be something like an instrument with European Investment Bank, European Investment Fund, or it should be what exactly? Like what kind of instruments this could be to coordinate?
Take the Scale Up Fund, right? I mean, it's a great initiative. The European Competitiveness Fund, same thing. I mean, we are providing already answers to China. We're already doing that. The problem is that they are tiny, right? I mean, consider this. Okay, so the European Scale-Up Fund is going to be around 3.5 billion, right? In available financing. That is the size of a medium municipal guidance fund in China. I mean, the Chinese just launched in December a fund that will be probably close to 100 billion. And the exit from their investments, 20 years. Now, typically in venture capital is, 5 to 7, 10 at best, right? I mean, they are coming with very big animals in the market. A municipal fund in China can be tens of billions. Right? We're operating for the whole EU with 3.5, right? And then too much of our innovation financing is grants in the MFF, right? I think my approach here is it should be more state-owned equity, which has two advantages. First, if professionally managed, and these funds in China usually have a lot of private management, right? I mean, from private VC because they know how to do this, but then they also build an elite in the state of learning how to do it too. Okay, so it's two advantages. First, is there is a sort of market discipline. You can't lose people's money. And then whereas with grants, you can lose them. Yeah. Even with the best conditionalities. And then the second thing is, if it works, societies are shareholders. So it's no longer, you finance yourself not just through taxation, right? You finance yourself through dividends that you get from the next industrial revolutions that can be powered through this innovation. The Chinese government, China has very low taxes, right? And it has low taxes in part because the Chinese state is the leading shareholder in the leading technologies. And I think Europe has to reclaim control over industrial over industrial innovation and commercialization by learning how to be smarter in terms of, we should have private venture capital and all that, right? But we should have more collectively owned equity capital, because that can also address our fiscal crisis. And the question you started from, where do we get the money from? Well, in part because we'll have dividends from that. Yeah. And another source of money that I mentioned in the report is that state-owned enterprises, especially energy companies that often have windfall, state-owned energy firms that have windfall revenue, one way is to take the money and put them in the common budget. But a portion of that could become this kind of risk capital of the state. Yeah. And if you look at how these Chinese guidance funds are structured in terms of their shareholders, Beijing Ministry of Finance shareholding is actually very low. It's about 17-20%. The rest is a little bit of state-owned banks. A lot of it is state-owned firms. And especially state-owned firms that are not innovative by definition. China Tobacco Company, it's a monopoly, right? Gas companies, utility companies, right? And they don't put all their money into this, but the coordination between state and the state-owned firms entails that they put a part of 5, 10, 1% of their dividend income into guidance funds. And the guidance funds then set up sub-funds jointly, often with venture capital, or in China, they tend to be like the dominant shareholder. It's basically in the venture capital market, is publicly owned. So we could use the state ownership that we have in Europe, that's much bigger than in America, in terms of creating these industrial champions of the future that would leapfrog Mercedes, VW, and the incumbents. Having our own Tesla moment or BYD moment, let's say, and then having a non-fiscal income through this channel, because this is what Matsukato, this is how she ends her book, right? The American state made a big mistake of financing innovation, but not being a shareholder in that. China is basically a shareholding state. This is how they get their money. And I think Europe should reclaim control in this kind of geo-economic competition with other industrial blocs by being the leader again, rethinking the way it finances and creates complementarities between state and market actors that in turn would solve the fiscal crisis that we need to address to secure our welfare states. At the end of the day, to me, this is what I care about. Why do I do this? Because I'm worried that we won't have the money to basically defend our social model. And you can't defend our social model with the incumbent technologies of the 20th century, right? You have to come with new actors in that market and think through ways of funding that. And the American model cannot do that. The American model is set for a digital innovation sector. It's not set to create an industrial base in America. In Europe, we have to create a new industrial base that's not the old technologies. And China, for that reason, was the model for me, because they came out of nowhere with 6G, robotics, EVs, wind turbines, and some of battery, energy storage, electrolysis, you name it. They control most of the critical technologies in the world, according to an Australian think tank. So that was not done through a Silicon Valley model. They took some of the lessons of Silicon Valley and they layered them into even some elements of the socialist economy, and they layered them on top of some European models, but then some of them came from examples from Singapore and Korea and Japan, and they created this hybrid. And we need that kind of radical open mind. I think in Europe, we often just look at one thing and then we wrangle over, we don't look at China because it's authoritarian. I think we should stop doing that, essentially. Like, this is a successful model. It does have a lot of waste and problems and political contradictions, etc. But it has some elements that work. And talk to any labor union organizer in Germany and tell them how they feel if they're in the car industry. And they're feeling very stressed. And we should stop providing an answer that's actually not accurate. They do it because they throw so many subsidies. Well, I would argue that they do it really well because they have a shareholding stake that's very good at it.
Well, this would mean kind of a revolution, I would say, a social democratic revolution, because this basically means this public ownership of these very precious assets, which, of course, we like very much at FEPS. This is the idea we promote also with our other projects. I'm just thinking how our European policymakers are going to take this on. I don't even say to follow through, because what I hear in these debates also here about innovation financing and industrial policy is that, yes, we like the state financing, also European Investment Fund, but let's not do too much because it will crowd out private investment.
Yes.
So I think this mentality maybe is the first obstacle of this very ambitious policy.
I mean, we have actually really good quantitative evidence about crowding out effects in China, right? And they are real, okay, but only in some sectors and under certain conditions. So it doesn't hold across the board, okay? So let me tell you what I mean. So where these guidance funds invest alone and are overwhelmingly state-owned and they have very little private participation, they crowd out and they're not very good. Where they invest jointly with private venture capitalists, because ultimately that's what they want to do there as well. I mean, they have somewhere in the neighborhood of 70 billion euros in private VC, like the Sequoia Capital, which is America's biggest VC firm, right, in technological innovations, has a wing in China that's now cut off. But it's called Sequoia Capital China, and they are the biggest one. I mean, and they are 30, 50 billion. They're very big. So the point of these GGFs is to bring those guys in as well. I mean, they don't want to just do it through the state. So when they work with these guys jointly and are based in, and this is very important, are based in industrial hubs that are sophisticated, usually coastal areas, they do really well. If they try to put them in provinces that had very little in the way of industrial sophistication and university technology, university innovation ecosystems, and they had to fold them. They had to close them down. They didn't, because the thing is, if they lose too much money, they shut them down. It's okay for these funds not to have shareholder returns as long as they deliver in their province. At the end of the day, after all these investments, the province has some industrial champions that came out of nothing as a result of these interventions. The short-term returns don't matter to them because they know that in the long term, they will get their dividends, yeah? So you have to be very careful where you place them. And I think that even the Chinese, through their very statist kind of intervention, are very careful to have them based in industrial hubs that are sophisticated, like Shenzhen and others, and Zhejiang and Hangzhou, and work with these guys, because then they kind of check on each other, they kind of care about peer review quality and so on. So I think just saying there's a crowding out effect is not enough. We have to ask under what conditions can the crowding out effect be mitigated or even eliminated, and a crowding in effect instead occurs. And I don't think we can afford this argument. I mean, frankly, I think that if you have a blanket crowding out theory from the 1980s, I think you're going to create a European technology trap, and you're going to create the conditions under which we become the semi-periphery to the Chinese global companies. It's enough to say that the former CEO of Stellantis said, at this rate in 5 years, we'll be happy if the Chinese car companies buy European car companies to save the jobs, because we are falling behind on what the car means today, right? It's a car today is in the EV space. And I think the EV is the future because the Americans are taking care of energy insecurity everywhere, is that is that car companies are mining companies, battery companies, electronics companies, software companies, AI companies in one, right? And it's very hard to do that with the incumbent firms unless new firms appear, or the incumbents feel, VW and others will feel so challenged that they will have to upgrade, right? And have digital companies be shareholders in them, and critical mineral companies be shareholders in VW, so they make their own batteries, so they don't have to. So we have to look at the Chinese coordination system that sits above these venture capital funds themselves, owned by the state. Because at the end of the day, in China also they care about making sure that you don't lose money like crazy, right? Yeah, you create jobs and you have technology leadership, but they are very loath to subsidize you if you lose money for a long time. They don't keep you alive. It's a very competitive market. They have 50 car companies, right? Just to take one sector. So in a way, it's a model that's both more dirigist and statist than ours, but also more liberal in a way. Much more competition, much more market discipline at the same time. So that's why I find it troubling sometimes when European policymakers talk about, of course, China does it because the state controls everything. Often it's not really because of that. The state doesn't have as much control as you think, and it's organized very differently than what you think. It's not a Soviet model of planning. It's more like a post-war French model of planning with a lot of updates. Yeah, and I've heard this from the mouth of several policymakers in China, actually.
That's very interesting that they used European model, upgraded it, and now
a model we don't use anymore.
We don't use anymore. Yes.
Or we use just kind of diluted forms of it.
So I think it's said somewhere that Europeans are very good at inventing things, but then someone else uses them.
Well, it's
in
because
this
we
case,
don't have
very successfully.
I mean, I talk a lot to Denmark has some really exceptional private venture capital funds that are also scale-up funds. So the Danes are extremely good at it, right? And if you talk to those people, they also care about having the nice Swedish, social system. They don't want to have some kind of dog eats dog, Silicon Valley, San Francisco. That's not their idea, right? And if you ask them, would you be bothered? Would you feel crowded out if the European Investment Fund would have 1 trillion euros in available capital and would be like, perhaps taking some of the promising companies that you're next? No, on the contrary. We really hate it when we grow European companies born from Danish or German technical universities, because this is where the innovation in engineering takes place. We grow them. They have orders for 50 million, 100 million, and then we have to sell them because that's what we do, right? This is our growth model. And then inevitably, they don't get picked up by Europeans. They get picked up by Asians. To give you one specific example. So if you're German today and you're very stressed about your job in a car company that depends on diesel, right? Keep in mind that what makes BYD, who is your nemesis, right? A very cheap car. There are many examples, right? But one of the reason why it's a cheap car is because the Chinese have bought an Italian company that made a very innovative press to make the encasing of the engine for the electric car so smooth and so without screws and without a lot of parts with just one hit, yeah? And they couldn't, those guys tried to sell it in Europe and they couldn't, right? Because there is this, what we call second value of death financing gap, right? When you're successful, you make your first millions, but then you have to build 6 factories in the next 3 years. Nobody's going to finance you there. The Chinese finance you when you're there. That's the big difference between us. So now, finally, after 6 years, BMW is bringing that price to Europe, etc., for the electric cars. So there is this story of European innovation that's absolutely spectacular, and we do well at taking them from giving them seed money. We're very good at that, right? The moment they need hundreds of millions, good luck, right? And then if you need billions, it's fine. Then everybody gives you money, yeah, because you're safe. So I think that's what we should look at. I mean, we still have a shot. We still have a lot of quality patents coming out of European universities. We don't have enough specialized companies that can provide the money and work with them, because these guys are geeks. They're engineers. They don't know how to pitch stuff, right? And grow them to the point when you can actually do an IPO at some point and be like a big European industrial firm. And the liberal answer to say, let's deregulate, there's some truth to that. I think sometimes we have crazy procurement and the regulatory consultation rules and so on. Sure, there's some of that argument, but the real answer is not what Merz said, that we have to work harder. When he came from China, he said, Germans have to work harder. That's not why China is successful, right? They work harder than us, it's true. They longer hours. But that's not the main reason. If you go to a Chinese car company, it's very automated. Yeah.
Good. I think it was very exhaustive and explanation and discussion, actually very interesting. And I get very excited, so because it looks like there are opportunities with pension fund, you mentioned, with state-owned enterprises. So there is a way to do this, and it seems like we are doing some things. But I think,
and Anna, it's not a lot of money. Think about it. It's 350 billion a year. Pension funds have about 13 trillion. So it really isn't that much what we're talking about here. So I want to leave you with that number, because it's really not some kind of gargantuan task. Do you know how much these Chinese GGFs have assets under management? It's about 400. It's somewhere in the neighborhood of, depending on the year, right? But to date, they have somewhere around $500 billion, right? Now, it's not that much money. Like the European Investment Bank itself is about 600 billion, right? So if China, which is, they will probably be soon 40% of global manufacturing, total global manufacturing. They are the only industrial superpower. We're next, right? After them. But if they only needed $500 billion, is it really that much money for us, right? And it really isn't that much money for considering the wealth we've accumulated. They don't have our pension funds, by the way. I mean, the Chinese pensions are horrible. And everybody has to save in these private funds, and the returns are very low, and etc. Right? So they have major disadvantages. They're aging. So there is a lot of waste still going on. But we have enough capital. We have enough collective capital. We need a bit more state capital, in a way that would crowd in even more private capital to generate these European industrial behemoths. We should stop being defensive. We should be like, no, we can leapfrog the Chinese in the next 10 years. Because we have what it takes. We have the industrial innovation, we have the capital, and the European institutions are learning. They are seeing this is a problem. They just can't, for reasons that are political, right? They can't mobilize enough money and have enough sectoral targeting to actually have a counterpart, a sort of equivalent to what the Chinese are doing. So we're learning pretty fast. We just need better political work to get this going.
Very good. I like this last point. This is exactly what we're here doing in Brussels, and I think this is what also happens as a part of MFF discussion and competitiveness fund and all other ongoing initiatives. So I think we round up at this.
Sure.
I feel very hopeful.
I mean, yeah, guardedly hopeful, right? Because yes. I mean, I wonder sometimes. I mean, the biggest risk here is some kind of like member state go it alone, right? There's a big temptation, and we've seen that with Next Gen and with the IPCIs. I mean, we see that. I think that we need to bolster the European pillar here in the financing. I mean, the most advanced forms of coordination of public capital with private capital that there are at the EU level, and I would say in France. I think BPI France is incredible, right? Also a couple of other member states are fantastic, also the Nordic countries to some extent. But I think we need to reclaim that kind of French dirigisme that gave France incredible technological leaps in the 1960s and 70s, yeah? From airspace to high-speed trains and nuclear power and so on, right? I mean, France went from being a relatively artisanal agricultural country to being an industrial leader in a very short period of time. And it wasn't a coincidence that when they did that, they had a combination of 5-year plans in a democracy with a lot of state ownership over finance and management of demand that was done in 38 planning commissions that involved everybody from labor unions to capital organizations. So there is a European planning tradition that the Chinese have, to some extent, reverse engineered from us, that we need to do across sectors in democratic ways that somehow would work with Europe's intergovernmental governance that would get us into a much better space than where we are today. And if you think that Silicon Valley is going to be an alternative to that, I think I would need a grant to test that hypothesis, but I would be very skeptical that that can deliver what you need. America is the reserve currency of the world, biggest financial center. That's where the savings are going. We'll never have that. They just have what some of my Danish venture capitalist acquaintances called stupid money. We will never have that stupid money, right? We're going to have much less money. We have to use them really well and to be much better coordinated and focused than both the Americans and the Chinese are in order to succeed. And I think if we are in a paradigm of, oh, this is just crowding out across the board, we're not going to be there. We're all going to run Airbnbs for the Chinese bourgeoisie.
Oh, no.
In 10 years.
No. Thank you for this
My pleasure.
Very exciting discussion and giving us hope and these great ideas, actually, because I think we need to be bold.